welcome. So I feel sort of incredibly lucky and, truth be told, a little bit starstruck to be introducing Dr. Keil today. He's really one of the most influential thinkers in my field of cognitive development. Dr. Keil got his undergraduate degree in biology from MIT, and then he went to Stanford for a master's in psychology and finished off at Penn for his PhD in psychology. He served on the faculty at Cornell for over 2 decades. He spent about half of that time as the co-director of the Cognitive Studies program before he moved to Yale in 1998, where he is now. He joined the faculty in the departments of psychology, linguistics, and cognitive science. And then in 2010, he was named the Charles C. and Dorathea S. Dilley Professor of Psychology, and he served as the chair of the psychology department at Yale since 2013. Are you still the chair?
Yeah.
You're still the chair. Of course, he also directs a lab. He directs the Cognition and Development Lab at Yale, which focuses on folk science, or how it is that children and adults both construct and interpret intuitive explanations that relate to things like causation and mechanism and agency, and he'll be talking to us about some of that today. He's advised just a huge number of talented students and postdocs who all do really interesting and groundbreaking work in this area. He's also written nearly 200 articles on these topics, a handful of books, including a new developmental psychology textbook, which is now widely used in the field.
I wish it was more widely used.
Oh, really? It might be too smart for the field. I think that's the problem. His 1989 book, Concepts, Kinds, and Cognitive Development, was literally the first developmental book I ever read in my life, and it really served as an inspiration to me and continues to, even today. Of course, he's also received a long list of honors in cognition and cognitive development, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Distinguished Scientific Award from the American Psychological Association, and an NIH Merit Award, among many others. And apparently you're an avid sailor, which I also discovered online, so hopefully you'll get to go out in the water in this beautiful place while you're here. Okay, that's all I have to say. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Frank is going to tell us about today, the mechanistic mind, and early interest in mechanism and its cognitive consequences.
Thanks, Karen. I'm sure to disappoint you after that nice introduction.
Definitely not.
So here's the way I want to try to frame the talk today. It seems, based on hints that you see in some developmental research, some of it going back almost 50 years, that kids have a foundational, very early interest in mechanism. And so that seems provocative. But then at the same time, most adults, lay adults, let alone young children, seem to have minimal mechanistic knowledge. When you actually probe them and talk to them, it just seems to be nothing there. And so the question is, what's with this early interest? First of all, is it real? Is it really focused on mechanism, or is it focused on something else and just sort of masquerading as mechanism? And secondly, if it is an interest in mechanism, what could it be there for if all we do is forget it after we're exposed to it? And so that's the kind of riddle I want to kind of address. And I want to suggest there's a way out of this riddle, which is actually quite interesting and surprising, and has implications for folk science, and even for science more broadly. So what are these mechanistic understanding? Well, we have probably the world's leading authority sitting right there on what it means to have mechanistic understanding in science. I'm going to caricature it a little bit so I can get through this with a working definition. That science is often equated with uncovering mechanisms. And what we mean by mechanisms is basically you have some phenomena where there's something to be explained, let's say cell mitosis, where you want to talk about how cells divide. And then you break it down into these subcomponents, often each of which has a functional nature of its own, and you talk about their interrelations. And in doing so, through the causal transfer or causal interaction to these components, you get insight into the overarching phenomena. The question we want to ask is whether folk science, these natural understandings that kids have and adults have of the world around them, is also key to trying to look for mechanisms, but just simply more skeletal, simplified clockworks. Science makes simplifications as well. In fact, we're always doing satisficing. We're never doing mechanistic unpacking endlessly downwards. We have to make decisions about how deep to go. And there's all sorts of heuristics we use. One of my grad students, Sam Johnson, did some really elegant work showing that when you have a hierarchy of mechanisms, people tend to like to stick at the same level as they travel across. They don't like to go up and down, up and down, up and down. And similarly, I think in science, you tend to try to stay at the same level. And you have to, because things unpack deeper and deeper and deeper. I love looking at mitosis because this degree of specialization in trying to understand how mitosis works gets more and more elaborate. If you look at just metaphase alignment, it turns out to be an incredibly complicated field with all these subspecialties looking at how exactly the alignment occurs, because if you don't do it right, you have all sorts of genetic defects. And the same thing's true for engineered systems. This might be a level of analysis of how a refrigerator works, but you can get deeper and deeper and deeper into getting modeling of hermetic compression and so on. No one does that in their folk psychology, but the thought is that maybe folk psychology and folk science in general is at this kind of a level. You have a very simple schematic idea of what's going on, of how cell division works, of how refrigerators work, and that's what it means to have folk science. Of course, maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's even giving too much. Another example would be, and this is actually related to some stimuli we've used, this was it mean to understand how a door lock works. There's all sorts of idealizations here. The real cardiology story is a 1,000-page textbook, but this looks to be a schematic level of understanding that perhaps is what we mean by we have folk scientific understanding when we extract it. So that seems plausible, at least on the surface. And it seems that adults care about mechanism. My colleague Luke Young has shown at length how reasoning about the real world often involves mechanism, and it trumps other form of adult information in adult causal reasoning. And it's more than just an ignorance bias. It's not that people simply like to know what's inside, because sometimes mechanism is totally visible. Bicycles and sailboats is another example I use because they're near and dear to my heart. You can have all the mechanisms be totally outside the surface, but still people want to unpack it. Causal interactions of parts are favored in ways that form stable clusters. So when you look at the insides, people tend to favor clusters that have certain kinds of integrity and not just any insides. But here's the hitch. Whether it's artifacts, biological systems, or non-living natural kinds, it's the same story. People don't seem to know the details. Those simple little schematic diagrams I show you, there's nothing like that actually going on in adult cognition as far as we can tell. Here's what you see if you ask people to draw, for example, illustrations of how things work. This is a typical drawing of how a heart works. And you would be dead instantly if that was your It's also not a problem of simply production, as you see it in recognition. And this is work done by Rebecca Wasson over in the UK. Just stunning errors in terms of how bicycles work. So she finds 50% error rates among Brits in terms of which one of these diagrams is a legitimate bicycle. This would not work, this would not work, you couldn't steer it. And she found this in Brits who are pretty avid bike riders. She even went to a bike cycling club where she found 5% error rates among people who regularly, daily construct and destruct bicycles. What happens is people often, when they're using a device, offload a lot of their cognition into the device, and so they can unpack it and take it apart and reassemble it, but they don't realize how much they're slavishly bound to having the device in front of them. Just as an aside, because I love this, there's an Italian artist, sculptor, who got into this. He read the article, which is really unusual, and had people draw drawings of bicycles and then made them. And they're really quite gorgeous works of art, but they're not bicycles. So the problem here is deep, because what we find is that it's not just that people don't learn it, it's when they do learn it, the knowledge decays radically quickly. And so this is something that you can get it in their heads, and we've done this in an informal way, and I'll talk about more formally in a second, where what we simply went is we found Yale undergraduates who had completely aced biology in high school. So these are kids who got 800 or 790 on the SAT-2, or 5s in the AP one. And the reason why we did that is because the Krebs cycle is actually an essential part of those tests. Everyone who gets those kinds of scores really pretty much masters this cycle. So we said, okay, great, let's go now look at you a couple of years later and see how much of it that you can still recall. Okay. And this is what they would do when they ace the test. They'd get all this stuff right. This is what happens to them. This is one of the best ones. And this is a lament of many science instructors in the college level. They talk about how these kids that went to introductory biology, when they come to the second sophomore level courses, seem to have retained nothing. We've shown this in a lot of ways, but there's a constant misunderstanding and underestimating of decay rates. We see it in this informal study I just described to you. More formally, Matt Fisher and I have shown this in what we call the cursive expertise studies. We look at people in their undergraduate majors, whether it be computer science or physical chemistry or molecular biology. And we ask them to estimate their current knowledge, and we ask them to estimate their knowledge, peak knowledge, when they studied it. What we find is basically, this is how much they think they're understanding something like the Krebs cycle. When we actually ask them to draw through the Krebs cycle, this is how they re-estimate their understanding, having tried to do it and realize it falls. It's actually lower than that. And this is their estimate of what their peak knowledge was. You see basically their estimates of their peak understanding and their original understanding are the same. They completely neglect how much their knowledge has dropped. We've done this in a more longitudinal way, introductory psychology. We took a big introductory psych course at Yale taught by Paul Bloom. We had complete records of how they did in the course, and we asked them to estimate their knowledge of various psychological effects, that we know exactly what they answered. And things like, how well can you explain how an fMRI works? How well can you explain how a neuron works? And what we find is that their actual performance, not surprisingly, declines over time down to pretty rotten after a long time. But this is what their estimated performance is. There's no drop at all. So people think they have these vivid mechanisms in their heads, when in fact the decline is pretty precipitous. So unfortunately, this story seems to be replicated again and again and again. It's worse, and this is older work that we've done, but I just want to mention it briefly because it inspired a lot of what we came to. We labored under these illusions of understanding that we simply don't have, and we call this illusion of explanatory depth. We've studied this at length, as have others in many other labs, and children have met this much worse. It basically, the paradigm is we ask, how well do you understand how a flush toilet works, how a zipper works, how anything works, and people estimate it. Then we say, okay, now tell us in detail how it actually works. And in light of that, what do you rate your understanding? Is it the same, or do you think it's a little bit lower? And then we often ask them to answer a specific question, and we see how that works. And we then read them an explanation and say, in light of this explanation, how well do you think you understand how it works? And so on, and they just go lower and lower and lower in terms of revising their understanding of how well they think it works. One of my favorite examples is helicopters. We ask people how well they think helicopters work. They say, oh, I don't. We teach them a scale, and they see what a 7-point understanding is, a 1-point understanding, a 3-point understanding. So they get really well calibrated. We check that they understand the scale of how it means to have this level of explanatory understanding. They might say, I have a level of 5 understanding of how the helicopter works. We then ask them to write it out, and it drops down to about a 4 or 5. Then we say, so how does a helicopter go from hovering to flying forward? And that usually completely blows them away. Because they have kind of a rotor model of helicopters, like these fixed things, and it's not that at all. And they often resort to things like, well, do they move forward in the cockpit? So this is what we find. We find that there's this initial level of understanding. It drops when we ask them to count it. It drops further when we give them a question. It stays low when we give them the next explanation. Then we ask how much they've learned, so we haven't just depressed them, and they come right back up. A couple other comments. The less you know, the worse the error. We initially ran this with graduate students. We just had them around, and they were easy to do as in the summer. Then we ran undergraduates, because undergraduates said, these grad students are arrogant. We would never make those mistakes. In fact, they drop even further. And the other thing is, when we debrief them, they often say, you know, this was a between subject design. Other people got flush toilets and zippers. You got cylinder locks in the helicopters. They say, I wish you'd given us other ones. I would have nailed those. Even in the debriefing, it doesn't work. So people think, and this is not too much of a caricature, that this is what they have in their heads about how a heart works, and this is what they really have. Okay. Yet, and here's the riddle. It looks like we all want to know about mechanism, especially young kids. The best examples of this are studies done, much of it done by Henry Wellman, but others as well, Maureen Kalaman, where you would look at kids confronted with riddles or puzzles, something puzzling, and they ask questions about why is it the case. And if you give them an answer that is not a good answer, they keep asking until they get a mechanistic answer. For example, if you say, a kid might say, why do flashlights have batteries? And an adult says, they do have batteries, that's right. That does not satisfy them. They're not at all happy with that. If you give an answer that is a fact-based answer but not mechanistic, like batteries are round and are shiny at each end, they also are frown and are unhappy. But if you instead say batteries have energy that makes the bulb light up, they're okay. They don't react, they don't disagree, they don't dream up their own mechanism. So there seems to be this quest for mechanism that seems to be specific to mechanism and not deterred by other kinds of answers. And it's not simply because of the presence of words like because. There's a cute study done by Kathleen Carwell showing that if you say, child says, why does it rain? And the adult says, it rains because water falls in the sky and gets us wet, versus it rains because clouds full of water and get too heavy. They're much happier with answer 2 than answer 1. So it's not something superficial like simply focusing on the presence of causal language. Then in a lot of other work more recently, much of it done by Caren, shows that explaining spontaneously or prompting them increases attention to mechanistically relevant features and internal properties. It's as if there's a focus on mechanism that gets enhanced by attempts to explain. And this also results in broader scope hypotheses being favored with the explanatory framework. It occurs in preschoolers and seems to suggest that a mechanistic mindset that can be triggered by early attempts to explain. So here we are in this funny riddle. What is going on with these kids? Why are they bothering? We know that their detailed mechanistic understanding is much worse than ours. So why are they doing it? What I want to do is tell you about some studies. I'm going to take you through a bunch of different kinds of attacks on this to look more directly at interest in the mechanism. Is the mechanism of interest real? Is it legitimate? And what does it mean? And we're going to do it largely by looking at knowledge. What kids infer about people who have mechanistic knowledge. So they infer it's more deep, more powerful, and more dramatic. Somehow, what I'm going to suggest is that by age 5 or so, kids seem to understand that mechanistic knowledge implies more deep, interconnected, and generalizable understanding of the world. So here's our first study in this effort. We simply say, how much does this person know on a 5-point scale where we illustrate what it means to know a lot versus a little. And we talked about some people who are disagreeing about a novel artifact, an electric car, a special particular kind of car, like we call them the Cayuga or the Seneca or whatever, and or a special kind of fruit and why it's better. They agree that the fruit is better or the car is best, but they disagree as to why. The non-mechanistic person says X is the best, this is for cars, because the colors to choose from are very pretty. When you turn on, it makes a cool sound. The seats inside are very comfortable to sit in, and the outside of the car is shiny because the village uses a special new kind of paint. The mechanistic person says X is best because the motor drives high quality, uses high quality wire, it makes up it run very smoothly. When you drive, you can speed up and stop quickly. It also has a very powerful battery, and the battery can be recharged quickly. So we then say, how much does each person know about the electric cars? The amount of language is the same, the amount of detail is the same, but one's mechanistic, one is not. And what you find is a huge preference, even in 5-year-olds, for the saying that the person who gives the mechanistic response knows more than the person who knows the non-mechanistic kind of information. This happens dramatically even with young kids, and then perseveres in adults. It works for both biological systems and artifact systems as well. Now, the way we set that up was we focused on external properties like shininess and color and sounds and stuff. What if we focused just on internal properties? So in a follow-up study, we talked about people, slightly different paradigm. Rather than how much they know, we said, simply, who knows more? It's a forced choice. We say, Mr. Jones, who thinks this, we're talking about hoverboards now, thinks the Graviton is the best kind of hoverboard because there's a special motor in each wheel so the wheels can turn at different speeds. There's a special sensor that changes the position of the wheels when the ground is uneven, and the battery recharges from the motor so it saves power. So these are all mechanistic, they connect, they all have to do with kind of motion and the dynamic operations of the hoverboard. Ms. Smith thinks the Graviton is the best kind of hoverboard because the motors are made of a shiny metal that doesn't rust, it's easy to clean, there's a special sensor that's easy to replace when it wears out, and the battery does not weigh much, so it's easy to carry. So we're now focusing on the same internal properties, but this is a non-mechanistic, doesn't explain how hoverboards work. Who knows more about hoverboards? And again, we see a strong preference for the mechanistic person. It was pointed out by some reviewers of this, though, that it's still not necessarily mechanism per se. There's another cue here, which is that this is internally directed versus externally directed towards external users. It's definitely not mechanistic, but there are other extraneous cues. So in a follow-up study that we just finished as of last Friday, there's actually still, we're probably going to do more in the area, but we actually designed it under very tight constraints. Let me see if I can get all the constraints. I'll just say it. We had the same number of words, the same level of technical complexity. The reasons were judged by judges as being equally good reasons, but these ones, the mechanistic ones, all explain how the different components are interconnected so as to serve the function of refrigeration. But these ones are internal, they're causal, but they're not related to the functioning of the object. The inside pipes carry the cooling liquid, they're made of plastic, they don't rattle loudly. The inside pump takes a little space, there's more space for the pipes inside the fridge. The thermostat is attached to the inside of the refrigerator with very strong glue so it doesn't fall out. And again, we find that there's a preference by 6-year-olds for what is the more truly mechanistic half than the other. I'm not saying kids totally nail the insight of what is mechanism, but they seem to have a preference for it. They're not mechanistically blind. They don't favor it under all circumstances. If you ask them, for example, if you could only choose one person to help you, which person would you pick? To sell the device, or to heal it, or in case if it's a biological system, or to fix it if it's broken, you'll see that in that case, they're going to pick for, if it's fixing the device, the person who has mechanistic knowledge, but if it's selling, they'll pick the person who has the other kind of knowledge. And so again, you get a swap. The fixing is seen as keying more on mechanistic understanding, but selling somewhat more weakly is preferred for the mechanistic, for the non-mechanistic story. Okay, so let me just repeat what we find. There's a bias to assume the mechanistic understanding is better and more powerful and more knowledgeable. It's not because the mechanistic reasons are considered better reasons for the choice. Kids are quite convinced as adults that liking something because of its shiny colors or the cool sound it makes is just a good reason for buying a car as its mechanistic understanding. That bewilders me, but that's what they seem to think. It's not related to the word length or complexity. It's not a simple focus on innards bias. It's not even simply whether the functions are other or inner directed. And we're doing a study right now to show, and so far the pilot data are very strong, it's not even teleological reasons as opposed to mechanistic reasons. If you give them teleological reasons, like it's functional reasons, they don't find that nearly as indicative of true, rich, deep knowledge as mechanistic understanding. In another study, we've shown that they think that mechanistic knowledge is much more generalizable. So we have two identical twins. We make sure they're controlled for in intelligence and so on. We read different books. The books are both very thick, and we show them laid next to each other. And we say, you'll hear about the kind of things that each twin learns, and your job is to decide who knows more about some different things. So, mechanistic knowledge, she learned which parts of the clock move. She learned how clocks keep working for years without stopping. Non-mechanistic, she learned where the clocks were first invented. She learned how many clocks are made each year, and so on for different objects. And then we ask, if you have this kind of knowledge, how much do you know about machines versus grandfather clocks versus other physical objects that are non-machines, like tulips? And the question is if you have mechanistic understanding, you understand that it has more implications for machine-based knowledge, but not for something like tulips. And that's just what we find. Even the youngest kids, in this case 5 and 6-year-olds, they find that they attribute more mechanistic knowledge to the subordinate class. Now, the funny thing about the young kids is they assume that the mechanistic person who knows more about how clocks work also knows more about grandfather clocks. The older kids and adults don't think that carries. But notice that they don't think it transfers at all to the unrelated category. So now we're looking at 5-year-olds, inferring that mechanistic understanding has superordinate broad scope, but not unlimited. It has to be within the same general category. Probably the most dramatic demonstration of this bias is work done by a postdoc, Emmanuel Trichet, who shows that even when you don't give any mechanistic information per se, kids understand that mechanistic frames are going to have a different kind of affordance than a non-mechanistic. So this is how it works. What do you want to know more about? I have here 2 booklets about storm clouds. We did this for lots of stuff, but storm clouds is an example we have here. They're both the same length, they're the same amount of information, but they say very different things. They have different kinds of information. I'm going to read you the very first part of one and give the very first part of the other, and you're going to tell me which one you think would help you learn the most or want to hear the most of more. So let me try to explain this. We're not going to give them any mechanism. All we're going to do is say, I'm going to tell you the story of the book. This book starts like the following. Different parts of a blank Venus flytrap or whatever work together by, or a surprising story about Venus flytrap is, And you say that's all they hear. And then we have some other examples. The way a fly trap works is by using, versus the strangest fly trap I ever found was this. Together the parts of a fly trap make it catch flies by, versus a special kind of fly trap exists that can. So is it clear what we're doing here? We have these different kind of setups. And that's all the difference is between them. We're not giving any mechanistic information at all. But nonetheless, when it's in the case of learning, they clearly realize that the mechanistic information is to be favored. When it's the default case, they don't. This gets stronger, but we find it even in 6.5-year-olds. So we've done it a little more sophisticatedly by looking at a third party. We say, we're interested in my friend Alex, who's just like you and is the same age as the child. And we're told that the child's goal is to choose the books for Alex, and we'll see what Alex says. And in one condition, we have 3 conditions. Alex says, I want the books that are the best for learning. In the fun condition, he says, I want the books that are the most fun. And the default condition is, I want the books that are the most interesting. This is an interesting condition we'll see in a second. What we find is that in the default condition, the kids are somewhat neutral. When it's the fun condition, they assume that mechanism is not much fun. The learn condition, they go the other way. This is a very strong effect by the time they're second graders. But the most interesting thing about this is this. There's a significant drop in the default of what would you like to read yourself towards mechanism that occurs around 8, 9 to 10 years old. And that's a moral that I think is a big one. I think mechanism is taught wrong in the schools, and this is one of the bigger sort of messages here. When people teach mechanism, they often teach it to kids by around 9 or 10, and then they quiz them on the details. And they feel like crap. Because what you've done is you've taught the mechanism, you try to get them to understand it, they parrot it back and they can't recall it, and they fail. And they say, that's what it means to learn mechanism, I don't want to learn that, and then they don't go on and do it. We want to pursue this further because the effect is not that strong, but it's certainly significant. And so one of the things that I care a lot about is the idea that you want to teach mechanism, but you don't want to teach it if you think the goal is to simply recall in mechanistic glory detail exactly how the clockworks work. So then the question arises is, why teach it? If you're not trying to get them to learn the details, what's the point? Let me just repeat what we've shown. A bias if mechanism emerges early. It seems to be specific to mechanism opposed to other kinds of information. It leads to biases, for instance, about breadth and depth of knowledge and learning preferences. Full why. Mechanism is problematic if the central learning goal is to simply remember all the details. But maybe mechanism has a whole different role than one we've understood. Maybe it mediates a different form of causal understanding that's more commonly feasible, that endures in memories and guides us. So what I want to suggest is that by exposure mechanism, we are getting tacit, implicitly, other kinds of knowledge that are much more powerful and effective towards guiding us towards folk science, but it's not what we call details. And here's what the idea is. It's a conduit to more abstract levels of causal information. The details evaporate, but what reside in memory and endure are things like how complex the system is mechanistically. So kids will extract from exposure to these learning experiences a sense, oh my God, this is a really hairy system, and I need to know that. It's not just visually complex, it's mechanistically complex. They might learn something about feedback loops or cycles or trends. This is an exponentially growing system, and this is one that is, a decay system, or this is a different kind of pattern. They learn something about kind of causality. Is it social causation versus non-social causation? They learn about functions. They learn about temporal patterns, about whether it's very quick or slow. And so one of our goals has been to show how it is that exposure mechanism results in these kinds of abstractions and what their roles are in cognition later on. So I'm going to focus a lot on complexity because the question of how we infer mechanisms of complexity has lots of potential import for kids in terms of how they decide when to defer to others. And there's lots of ways you can figure out mechanisms of complexity. You can do it from surface properties, from looking at how a device or an object behaves or is used, from direct exposure mechanism, and also from social information. People saying, hey, that's really hairy. It's distinct from procedural and visual complexity. Something can look very complicated but be mechanistically simple, and something can be easy to use but be very complicated, like a cell phone. The way we started on this was we wondered, and this is a very simple study, this is work done with Jonathan Kaminsky, if you ask kids about how complicated things are mechanistically and you teach them how to use that scale, do they have intuitions that are consistent? Do they agree with each other in terms of the mechanistic complexity of the world around them, even though they can't tell you any of the details? And what you find is that by 9 or 10-year-olds, there's very strong consensus about the mechanistic complexity of devices, whether it's a flashlight or a vacuum cleaner or a submarine or an airplane. By the way, these don't have to be veridical, it's just that people tend to agree. Okay. There's some agreement among the younger kids, but not as strong. But the point to make here is that none of the people in these groups at any age can tell you actually how they work. They just have these intuitions about complexity that persevere and are fairly consistent. If you ask them about how hard it is to fix, they're even stronger, there's more consensus. It turns out that young kids sometimes confuse complexity with use as opposed to fixing. If you focus on fixing, there's a remarkable convergence. If you look at Cronbach alpha scores, there's an increase between 7 and 9 in adults, but they're all doing pretty well even the younger ages. It falls apart under 7. And the more complex something is, the more they think they need to defer to others. So they say, I would need help in understanding this. It very closely correlates with the complexity ratings. As I said, kids are also focusing a little bit on functional complexity, but not exclusively. One of the other cues we've been looking at is when you're inferring complexity, mechanistic complexity, to what extent can you look at how a device behaves? And so to try to get that, Rick All and I have done a lot of work on describing new artificial devices and what they can do. So imagine you have a device that can pick daffodils and strawberries versus one that can pick just daffodils. And I'll show you two complex interiors, one that's simple, has a few parts, one has a lot of parts, and I'll ask you to map them onto them. If you do that for kids, they completely get it, even in 4-year-olds. They say, well, of course, this interior goes inside this object, and this interior goes in this object. So that's not hard at all for them to figure out. But we thought, is that all there is to figure out what's mechanistic complexity, just number of parts? Well, no, there's a lot more to do with the nature of complexity than that. So we had a more subtle count, which is we have this device which can clean jeans and slacks, and this device that can clean jeans and glasses, this device that can pick daffodils and daisies, the first one that can pick daffodils and strawberries. And again, we have the same interiors that go a little blurry. We asked which one has which insides. If you give these to adults, it's a no-brainer. They all assume more complex interiors for more diverse functions. If you give it to kids, just look at the dark blue bars for a second. They completely miss it between the 4 and 5-year-olds. And then there's a step function where they jump up between 6 and 7. These kids had no insight into the fact that more diverse functions imply more mechanistic complexity inside. Interestingly, if you ask them which machines do more different things, they totally nail it. So they're perfectly sensitive to the fact that this is more diverse in terms of its functional opportunities, but they don't somehow connect that to realizing there must be more mechanistic complexity inside. Why that is unclear to me, but we've robustly replicated it a number of times. So there seems to be a fair amount of learning that goes on during the elementary school years in terms of the implications of diversity and complexity. Rick has gone on to follow this up in a number of ways. Kids do seem to, what's something we're working on now, they seem to have some awareness that number of parts is not all there is to complexity. They know that beanbag chairs are not complicated, even though they have 1,000 parts. I don't know how many parts beanbag chairs have, but they have a lot. So the office chair, with these complex, trendy chairs that has 20 parts that makes it recline all these funny ways, they know that's more complicated. They start to understand that architecture matters in subtle ways. The heterogeneity of internal parts, the more different they are from each other, tends to be a clue to mechanistic complexity, that you have stable modules, that there's hierarchical embedding, certain patterns of rich connections. And they may, although at least adults, seem to understand that complexity is different in machines versus electronic circuits, where more heterogeneity is more important to complexity in machines than it is to electronic circuits. So what extent are these extracted by young children? Rick has looked in particular at number, diversity, and connectedness. And he has cases where he asks kids, he shows kids things like a flashlight and a cell phone, and he shows electronic circuits inside them where you have one battery, one yellow part versus one battery, one yellow part, and they vary in terms of number, they vary in terms of diversity, all the parts are the same, and the parts are more different, they vary in the degree of connectedness. And what he finds, just look at the green for a second, is that 5-year-olds are very sensitive to numbers as a proxy for complexity. But in terms of diversity and connectivity and stuff, they seem to ignore it. And then they jump up again between 6 and 7. So this converges with the earlier study on using diverse functions. At the same time, if you ask them what is more hard to fix or learn about, in this case, learn about, they seem to recognize that these are more complex, the ones that have more of these different functions, but they don't connect that to complexity. So, where are we? Kids love mechanism, they're center mechanism, they use it to extract a sense of complexity, but they have a lot to learn about the subtleties of how architecture yields complexity. All this is sort of snapshots of kids. The question we've tried to ask, which is much more hairy, is whether we could actually shift intuitions by exposure to mechanism. So this is one of my first major large-scale intervention studies I've ever done, and it was pretty flawed, so we're doing it a second time. But let me try to illustrate to you what we did and explain to you what we learned. We went to a school in New Haven, which was euphemistically an underserved population. What it really means is these kids were really disadvantaged in every way you could imagine. And we taught them mechanistically how a couple things worked, a heart and a lock, a cylinder lock. Half the kids. And the other kids got non-mechanistic descriptions, simply facts about hearts and locks. We wanted to see whether that would shift their intuitions about mechanistic complexity as a result. So, the non-mechanistic explanation told them where the heart was, told them about its size, told them about its color. Non-mechanistic explanation of doors told where on the door the locks usually typically are, how they vary in shape, and how keys vary in color. The heart mechanism explanation went through valves, we call them little doors, and we explained literally how the valves worked in the heart, how it pumped blood. And for the key, cylinder lock, we explained how the pins are aligned by the key and how that allows it to rotate. So we gave a full mechanistic explanation. And what we find is that if the children think prior to the experiment that hearts are simple, after being told about how they actually mechanistically work, they enhance their understanding of ratings of its complexity, but not in the case of the facts. If they're already complicated, we don't nudge them very much. We had a smaller, not significant effect for the lock. We then went back 3 weeks later to see if these intuitions persevered. And they do, although there's some leakage such that now the non-mechanistic kids also seem to have shifted, and we think it's because they were talking to each other. But what's interesting is the details vanish. So we have a lot of queries about details. This graph is a little complicated because it turns out their kids were two groups. About half the kids didn't remember anything. They're very low retention. The other kids, the mechanistic kids, showed a huge drop in learning all the details. So we would ask them things like how many doors were there in the heart, what color was the heart, and all that stuff seems to vanish. What's interesting is that the details vanish more in the mechanistic condition than in the non-mechanistic condition. It's as if when you focus on mechanism, you say all this other stuff's extraneous, I'm not going to remember it. It almost flushes the memory. And that leads to something like Todd Lombroso's work, which showed the same kind of thing. We also asked them to be expert diagnosis. So this is one of the things we think goes from exposure to mechanism. You don't remember the mechanistic details, but you remember enough to be able to tell who's shitting you or not. Excuse the language. You can tell who's telling you the truth. So we had a real expert who says the heart is like a pump. It takes blood from the body and moves it throughout the body. The heart is like a factory where blood is made before going to the body. Okay, and so on. All these different kind of things the experts would say. And then we tested them to pick the diagnosis apart and figure out who's the real expert or not. The results aren't great, but they are significant and work in the right direction. Namely, that the mechanistic exposure allows them to pick the appropriate expert. Especially strong for the lock. I will also add the kids love the task. Knowing that you're studying mechanism, not to remember it veridically, but to use it as a way of diagnosing who knows what in the world around you seems to be a very natural thing for them, and they pick up on it and use it very intensively. Also, this is a small sort of side study of the same study. we showed them a kidney, and we asked them, how complicated do you think a kidney is? If they got the heart, and if they increased the complexity rate for the heart, they did it also for the kidney, but they didn't do it if they got the lock. So ratings on the heart complexity transferred to other organs, but not to other domains such as artifacts. There's a whole kind of area of research we're now exploring on mechanistic versus visual complexity. There's only a crude correlation. This is not mechanistically complicated, it's just a jumble of parts in a drawer. This is mechanistically complicated. I can't remember what the hell this is. I think it's a printing press. And you can easily put them against each other where things are visually complex, but not mechanistically complex or vice versa. I think mechanistic complexity develops slowly. Kids get more and more sophisticated in understanding all the properties that relate to deciding whether something is truly a complex mechanism. But it starts early and then it goes gradually. So now we try to do this right, and this is the most ambitious study I think we're ever going to do in terms of training and teaching. But it's got us very excited because the pilot data are coming in very strong, and it's crazy. We found an adult college video, this is vocational college, of how an engine works, an internal combustion engine. As some people point out, this is probably a folly since everything's going electronic, and who want to learn about internal combustion engines, but nonetheless, it's a great video. So we took the actual video they use, and only thing we did is we changed the narrative, because the narrative was really dreary. And so here's an example of, I was going to give you part of the clip. It's a 7-minute video.
This is what the inside of a car engine looks like when the car doesn't move. And here's the engine when the car moves. Do you see all the parts moving? I'm going to tell you about them. This part that turns at the bottom is called the crank. It's the crank that makes the wheels of the car turn. So when the crank turns, the car moves. But the question is, what makes the crank turn? Well, it's the parts attached on top of the crank. They're called the pistons. When the pistons are pushed down, they bounce back up, and when they move up and down, they make the crank turn. So now the question is, what pushes the pistons down? Before explaining what pushes the pistons down, I need to tell you about the parts above the pistons. You see this long bar with black parts on it? It's called the camshaft, and the parts below with the red springs are called the valves. Do you see this weird shape of the black parts on the camshaft?
Oh, stop. This is a pretty complicated video, and we show this to kids as young as 5, and first of all, they adore it. Which is very few kids say, oh, this is technical and weird, and I don't want to see it. They adore it. Now the question is, do they get anything out of it? Are they extracting it? I can tell you for sure that they can if you ask them afterwards, tell me how a car engine works, do a very good job at all. But nonetheless, through exposure to this kind of video, we think that they're going to extract some very interesting, powerful concepts that will endure. And here's some of the things we're testing. We've piloted about 20 kids, and the results are very strong, so I think it's going to hold up, but I can't give you any data slides yet. One is the idea of central versus distributed control. The thing about a car engine, although maybe it's changing as they get more electronic, is that all the parts interconnect in this complicated way, but there's no central thing that drives the whole thing. It's a chain of events that are going to go around. And so we asked, for example, and we use our expert detection test, which is the test they love. Who's the real expert? One expert says, in an engine, the speed of the parts is controlled by the parts right next to them. In an engine, there's one part that's connected to most of the parts and controls how fast they go. And we're finding in our pilot studies that they strongly favor this when they've had exposure to the engine, but when they haven't, they favor this one. So they seem to have learned this abstraction. Now, nowhere in the video do we say this. All we discuss in the video is each part and its causal connection to the next part. So we just go through the chain of events. But they abstract from that little chain of events this more general principle about control. That's why I said they get some sense of control. Containment. The critical thing to understanding an engine is that there has to be times when the gas is contained in its explosion and you harness that explosive power. So we have the valves are important because they hold the gas in for a little bit. We never say that directly. Valves are important because they clean the bad stuff out of the gas. Again, we get a shift. Those who see the mechanistic exposure, again, this seems to work. And finally, timing and synchrony. In an engine, one part goes faster, all the other parts have to go faster too. That's correct. In an engine, some parts go faster, other parts have to slow down to save energy. Sounds really compelling, but it's not true. And again, we find the splits. So the claim is, this is the point of teaching mechanism. And we should be teaching it all over the place. Kids love it. It has a really enduring impact, but not if you're focusing on remembering all the details. It's at these kinds of levels of the abstraction that it works. They do it automatically without sort of explicit instruction. We didn't give those explicit details. They get it from exposure to mechanism. And it helps solve deference networks. What I mean by that is it lets you know who are the relevant experts around you to approach, because you have a sense of what the mechanistic kind of universe is like and who's likely to be experts in different areas of mechanism. I think they're intrinsic to folk science. I think that we should be teaching mechanism much more than we do. What's happened in a lot of school systems is they say, these kids can't remember any mechanism. Don't bother teaching them until they hit high school. Let's just focus on the nature of science. Let's focus on control of variable strategies or the knowledge is subjective. And kids hate that stuff. They just find it boring. They love mechanism. More than that, when you get these abstract causal patterns here, they use them to locate domains and experts. They use them to evaluate experts. They use them to evaluate explanations themselves. So we have lots of work in each of these areas showing that the quality of an explanation can be influenced by the degree to which you have mechanistic understanding. We've shown in some older work that it also allows them to solve the division of cognitive labor. For example, if you say, these two people, John knows all about why people fight when they get tired. What else does he know because he knows that? Why people smile, friends smile at each other when they see them, or why salt melts icy driveways quicker. Now, we got social psychology versus chemistry going on here. And what we find is that even at age 5, kids can recreate most of the major departments of the university, the physical sciences, biological sciences, and the social sciences. They can't do humanities, because humanities have no causal structure. Sorry, but it's true. They have other wonderful virtues, but they can't do humanities. But what they're doing here is they're using their sense of what kind of causal regularities there are in the world, and we've shown this in a bunch of follow-up studies, to unpack this. They're able, sensitive to causal regularities, and they understand that someone who understands one kind of causal regularity will have other ones that also arise from the same phenomena. They don't know the labels for these departments, and they get a few things wrong in interesting ways. For example, they took political science and economics problems and didn't actually take political science and economics separately. They had macro and micro systems, and instead that's how they collapsed it. But that's not a bad choice. In fact, some people think that's an interesting one. These causal patterns also serve the following functions. They allow us to engage in relearning. This is an incredibly neglected area of psychology, and that is when these undergraduates in these science courses come in for a sophomore level science course, and the professors say they haven't learned anything from intro psych or intro biology, they don't really mean that. They haven't extracted something that they bring into the second learning take. But it's not the details. It's something more abstract. It's knowing what's causally relevant. It's knowing these sort of schematic patterns. And so we're finding, I think, that exposure to mechanism allows you to gauge your relearning better, reverse engineer systems, diagnose and fix things better, know its causal relevance, and extract gist. And we've done work on this as well, showing that knowing what you should extract, like note-taking, where you should be focusing on the important gist of something, is all coming from mechanism. The other point about this is another line of work I just want to mention, is we massively outsource our mechanistic understanding. We use our abstract patterns to improve this skill. By knowing what kind of mechanisms there are in the world and how they're clustered, we can know which experts to refer to when we're trying to understand issues. We need to encounter mechanisms to outsource properly. Provides critical information on what kind of understanding is needed and who has it. And also when we should outsource. If things are really simple mechanistically, we don't need to outsource, we should own it ourselves. We underestimate how much we outsource like crazy. We've done this in a variety of ways. We've demonstrated this with a search engine. In fact, Matt Fisher and I, Marielle Godot, a couple of years ago, did a study showing that when people Google things on the internet, their sense of understanding gets inflated temporarily, and then it shrinks again. I can go on to more about that, but it's only understanding of stuff that's Googleable, not stuff that they know is not Googleable. And just very recently, Emery Richardson, one of my grad students, has shown that when kids are helped learning how mechanisms work, like complex devices, and you scaffold that instruction by arranging the pieces so they can see how to operate the device, or you give hints that don't look pedagogical, they completely ignore the fact that they've been scaffolded, and they have completely neglectful of it. I think this issue of knowing how to divide up the universe of cognitive labor and tap into it is actually not just a skill for folk science, it's a skill of science. A friend of mine at Yale who studies the molecular mechanisms of cell movement has talked to me about who he relies on to understand this. And there's this huge deference network of different researchers, and he does not understand a whole lot about what each of these guys can do. He consults with people like mechanical engineers on lattice structures to understand how these actin superstructures push out cell membranes. And he does all this different stuff, but he has to know enough mechanism and enough sense of how things work to know who to defer to for which questions. It all interconnects. If you don't have access to some level of mechanistic understanding, you can't solve these deference networks. Okay, so what are the unanswered questions? There's lots. How much detail do we need for the best mechanism exposure? How much important are idealizations where we abstract away relevant particulars? There's different types of mechanism. You can have origins mechanism. How is it that a car is made versus how does a car work? So there's different kinds of levels of approaches of mechanisms. I've argued that there's slower decay for higher level causal patterns. I think we've shown this. In fact, sometimes the irrelevant details get suppressed. Or we can ask whether certain kinds of causal patterns are particularly robust, such as complexity. And we can ask how does mechanism enhance higher level retention? How much and how interactive and how explicit should it be? And finally, and something we've been working on very recently, is mechanism a powerful truth tracker? So what I mean by this is, if you're trying to find out where someone knows what they're talking about, and you want to ask them questions, like fake news kind of things, if you ask them facts, like someone says that, for example, cell phones give you brain cancer, and you say, well, how much does they increase the risk of brain cancer? The person can just BS something. They can say 5 times more. And how are you going to check that? So giving you facts doesn't help that much. If you ask about the source, where did you hear that? I read in Science magazine, or I read in the New York Times. They can lie and they can deceive you. But to deceive on mechanism is much, much harder. It's much harder to make it up. And so people have a sense that mechanism, if you focus on mechanistic questions, they're much more revealing as to whether someone can fake it. And I can talk more about that. It turns out to be much more subtle and interesting than I just said. People are so convinced that mechanism is the truth, the pathway to truth, they give them bogus mechanism, they get snookered by it. So they're not actually that good at evaluating mechanism. So they love mechanism, but they love it too much. Okay. That's it. I'll go to questions.